Emma Katz, welcome to the Science of Psychotherapy podcast. So good to have you with us.
Thanks, Matt.
Yes, and it's Richard here, so lovely to see you.
Thank you.
Emma, just give people a bit of an idea of where you are in the world and what you do.
I'm in Liverpool in England, and I'm senior lecturer in childhood and youth at Liverpool Hope University, and I'm a domestic abuse researcher and specialise in coercive control. So that's the kind of domestic abuse where it's all about control, where the perpetrator's mission and goal is to get control of another person and keep that control. It's the most dangerous, most nasty, most horrible form of domestic abuse.
Yes, and of course, I came across you because of my daughter. For those of you who haven't heard me skiting about her wonderful work, her book, See What You Made Me Do, which is coming out in England, I think late this year or early next year, and America as well. So
I think it's in August. I've got it pre-ordered on Amazon.
Oh, well, see, you know better than me. So that's fantastic. But she recommended you, and there's certainly the study that has just come out, but you've been doing this work. And let me see, when coercive control continues to harm children. Now, here's the thing that I thought was very important, is that after the colon was post-separation fathering, stalking, and domestic violence. So this post-separation situation as well. So we can talk about the during the disruption that's going on in the marriage, and then post the disruption going on in the marriage. What's a bit of that, something about this paper, and perhaps if there's some other background you want to give it to us?
Great. So, yeah, I think the thing about coercive control, for people who aren't sure what that means, the word coercion means like force or really heavy pressure. So it's a behavior where somebody's getting somebody else to do as they're told, do as I tell you, or else. They're threatening them. They might be threatening them, do as you're told or else I'll hit you, but it might be do as you're told or else I'll cut down what you can spend, or I'll upset you emotionally, I'll call you nasty names, I'll harm your children. So it's this do as you're told, do as I tell you, or else I will harm you. And perpetrators of that kind of abuse, they don't respect a partner's decision to end the relationship and leave, because they're all about the control. They've invested months, probably years, in controlling this person, and they're not about to give up that control just because the partner's trying to leave them. Far from it. So leaving is actually one of the most dangerous times for the survivor, because the perpetrator will redouble their efforts to get that control, and that might mean an escalation of violence, an escalation of stalking, an escalation of doing all sorts of other harms. And this is the time when people are most vulnerable to being killed by their partner. That happens with horrible frequency. Obviously, it doesn't happen to most people who are trying to escape, but it is the most dangerous time. And I believe the statistic in Australia is that one woman a week is killed by their current or former partner. And
certainly that, and a little bit more. It's 1 point sort of something. But we've had a very interesting set of commercials come on recently, which I think are quite useful. And what they do is they take the sound out when one of the partners in the conversation comes to the excuse, saying, I keep an eye on her phone because, and then they take the sound out to say, there's no excuses. But I think that's one of the frameworks of, we know what in this particular matter. I know we're talking a lot about males, but of course we know that there's coercive control across both genders, but males tend to do this statistically more frequently. But this thing of I'm just monitoring where she is because I'm worried about her, and I want to make sure she's safe. So coercive control certainly can be expressed violently, you do this or, but it's also done, it can be done rather, what is it, subversively? What is the word I'm trying to say? They do it through Yeah, what have you found with that type of coercive control?
Absolutely. So some researchers think that the perpetrators who use violence are actually the ones who are not so bright, because using violence kind of gives the game away. It's much easier to spot that somebody is abusive if they are actually being violent. If they're not being violent, everyone struggles so much more to identify this is an abuser. And so perpetrators who are clever enough to get away with controlling somebody without violence, they're much harder to pin down, much harder to hold accountable, to prosecute. So the survivor might believe that it can't be domestic abuse. That's what we call it here in England. It can't be domestic abuse because I'm not being hit. Children in the family might really struggle to understand that what usually dad or stepdad is doing is abusive because he's not violent. So how can it be abuse? And the friends, the family, the neighbors, the community, they're all going to struggle so much more when there isn't violence to identify that this person is abusive. But perpetrators who don't use violence have been shown in a few studies to be just as harmful as the ones who do, because what coercive control is the perpetrator doesn't want a partner, they want a sort of slave-like figure, they want a puppet, they want to take another human being and turn that human being from the normal kind of human being, which has freedom, has autonomy, has self-determination, can make choices about their own life. They want to strip all that away and turn this full and free human being into their sort of slave or puppet-like figure who simply exists to do their bidding and to please them. So that's an incredibly difficult thing to pull off, which is why perpetrators are so abusive, because they need to be highly abusive to turn a full and free human being into a slave-like figure. It takes years. You have to chip and chip and chip away at the person. You have to take away their freedoms gradually, subtly over time. You have to keep them confused. You have to keep them off balance, doubting their own sanity, their self-esteem going down and down all the time. You have to keep them away from people who might help and support them. So isolating them from family and friends, perhaps planting the idea in their head that your family doesn't really love you, they're just causing trouble, I'm the only one who cares about you. And as you said, Richard, the excuses. I'm doing this because I care about you so much. I'm doing it to protect you. You're not competent to make decisions. You get things wrong. Let me make all the decisions for you. Let me manage the finances. Let me pick your friends because, that friend of yours, they've been gossiping about you. They've told me that they don't really like you. Your friends don't really like you. I'm the only one you can rely on. So it's mind games, mind games, mind games. And something else that coercive control relies upon is that perpetrators have to include periods of behavior that appears to be nice, because without that, the partner would think, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. So every so often they have to throw in some false hope, have to, give you presents, be friendly and attentive. And that they go through cycles of doing that. And when the partner's got to the point where they're thinking, I can't put up with this anymore, I'm going to leave, that's when they'll go into a new cycle of being nice, presents, and then the partner will think, oh, they've gone back to the person who they were when I met them. Maybe this was all just a sort of a bad dream. There's some hope here that things can get better. I'll stay. I'll try harder. So the false hope is so important to keep the person trapped. And I believe it was the American researcher and practitioner Lundy Bancroft who's written some great work. And he said that it doesn't matter how nice the perpetrator is being at the moment, because all perpetrators go through periods of being nice. The thing is how respectful and non-coercive they're being, because even during their nice phases, they're not going to be respectful and they're not going to be non-coercive. They're still going to want everything their own way. So a sign of change is not that the person is being nice. It's, have they become fully respectful and non-coercive? Are they treating you as a free, autonomous human being? And no coercive control perpetrator will be doing that.
Right. Emma, can we get a bit of an idea of what are some of the common examples of some of these more subtle things that perpetrators do, which, they may be hard to identify. It's not, just overt violence. They may be things that we might not immediately, as you said, think of as, something that is. Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, just maybe some real, some real world sort of stories too, which is always sobering, but brings it to reality.
Absolutely. Well, one mum who I interviewed in my research said that for 15 years he'd been really controlling, but he'd always turned it around and blamed it on the fact that she worked, and said that if only she would give up her job, then things in the relationship would be better. And he was jealous of her speaking to any other males, and if she went to the park with the kids, then he accused her that she was trying to have an affair with the gardener in the park. If she took the kids to children's birthday parties, then it was because she was having an affair with the dad in that family. And over time, it became worse and worse, and he would have her on a curfew. So she had to be back by, say, 4 p.m. in the afternoon, or else the accusations, you're having an affair, where have you been, what have you been doing? So the children couldn't go to an after-school club. She couldn't take them out after school. They couldn't, see their friends after school because she had to be back by 4 p.m. or else, he would get really nasty. He wasn't violent, but there'd be the accusations, the name calling. So often what survivors do is they try to change their behavior to please the perpetrator, which means giving up so much of their own freedom and autonomy. And they think, if I just do what he wants, then, or sometimes what she wants, because as you say, it can be the other way around. If I just do what they want, then maybe it'll be okay. But it isn't, because the perpetrator, can't behave like a normal partner no matter what you do. So after 15 years, she was seriously thinking about leaving. They'd had 4 children. He was very sexually coercive. He would force sex on her when she didn't want it, which is rape, even though they were married, it is rape. And she was starting to think about leaving. And that was the point when he attacked her for the first time. And she said, I know it sounds really weird, but in some ways I was glad that he hit me, because at least then I could show somebody what he had done. I could show them my bruises, and I could, they would understand that something abusive had happened. Whereas the physical, she said, whereas the emotional and the sexual stuff he was doing was so hidden, I didn't feel I could explain it to anybody. She didn't feel she could go to a police station and say, that he's calling me all these names, he's making me feel worthless and small, that he won't let me make my own decisions, that, he pressures me into sex and forces me into sex when I don't want it. She thought that if she went and said that at a police station, she'd be told, you're a stupid cow, go home. And perhaps she would have been told that. The police response is sometimes really good, but sometimes really poor. I think it's a bit of a lottery as to the police officer that you get at the time and how much they understand these issues, and what the culture is in that particular police station as well. So and that was the catalyst for her leaving. But even when she left and the children left, he continued to stalk her. And she described how her and the children would live upstairs, and they knew that he was lurking about outside. They were scared, so they would grab what they needed from the downstairs, and then they would spend their time in the upstairs where they felt slightly safer. And they were very limited as to where they could go, because they knew that he was following them. So it was like they were still living in prison, even though they had left. And I asked her, when did that end? Because, I could see it wasn't happening now. It was about 4 years post-separation when I interviewed her. I said, when did that end? And she said, it was when he attacked me again and got remanded in custody. And I thought, how ridiculous that our systems are so weak and ineffective that they have to wait for her to be attacked again, for him to attack again, before they'll stop this behaviour. Her and 4 children were living like prisoners in their own homes, and we weren't doing anything about that as a society.
Right. So it's just this understanding of a cultural, what does the culture say is legitimate abuse?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Indeed, yeah. And what do we take seriously? Coercive control is what we would call a course of, trying to say this word, a course of conduct crime. So it's not a one-off event. It's about the course of conduct over several months, several years. So each behavior on their own may not look that serious, but if you piece them all together, what you have is the adult and the children, if there are children in that relationship, who are basically in prison in their own lives, who have no freedom, no autonomy, are being completely controlled. And all these one-off incidents, they're like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. They don't look significant when you see them separately, but when you put them together and you see the jigsaw puzzle, you see what's happening. And our own laws and our own culture are really poor at the moment at doing that. There's a great book by Evan Stark, who's an American researcher, called Coercive Control: How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life. And that was a breakthrough book in our field. The concept of coercive control had been around before that, but he was the one who brought it to public attention a lot more. And that led to coercive control being made a crime in the UK, which it is now. And I know there's discussion of making it a crime in other countries, but those discussions are ongoing. It hasn't happened so much yet, but I'm hopeful that it might do.
Yeah.
And here's an interesting thing too, because that segues a bit into what this paper was about, which was moving on from looking at just the marital partner, but actually looking at the children and the impact. And I believe, if I'm looking at the paper, there were 29 children from the UK and from Finland. And it was all, the father was the coercive controller. And you came down to a few sort of categories, and then some ideas and suggestions of how to help manage those sort of problems. Can you give us a bit of an insight into those sort of three types of fathers, which I think probably intermingle a bit as well? But how did you find that?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, let me say that this paper that you're talking about, When Coercive Control Continues to Harm Children, is free to access. So anyone listening can just Google my name, Emma Katz, and the title of that paper, and you can get the paper for free. It is really important to us to make it, open access. It's not behind a paywall, because we know so many people go through this, and there's so many practitioners supporting people going through this, and we wanted it to be free to them.
Yeah, we'll have a link. We'll have a link for it on our the show notes. So that's
fantastic. And if anyone wants copies of any of my other papers, just feel free to email me, and I'll send them over to you. And you can easily find my email address. So in terms of what we found, so we interviewed with 29 children in the UK and in Finland whose fathers were coercive control perpetrators. And we looked at how those children had experienced the fathering of those men, and, what things had looked like from the children's perspectives. And we found three different things that came out of that. The first was that some children had experienced their fathers as really, really dangerous. They were terrified of their fathers. Their fathers had stalked them, and their mothers had hounded them, had made their lives very terrifying and unpredictable. So children described things like how dad had brought some other men to the house, and they'd been banging on the doors and the windows, and I'd feared for my life and I hid, just as an 8-9-year-old boy. And another boy described how dad had lurked in the back garden and as part of his post-separation stalking, and while he was doing that, he chopped down my tree, my favorite tree, which the child took as a very personal sort of a very personal act against him. Dad knew this was his favorite tree, and he chopped it down while he was lurking in the back garden. Children described being afraid to go to school because they didn't know if their pets would be alive when they came home again, leaving their pets in the house when they were at school. They described how they'd had to pack up and leave several times because, every time their dad found them in a new place, they'd had to escape because of the danger. And so they'd had to leave their friends and their school and their local area and a lot of their stuff at just a moment's notice. And this could suddenly happen. Life would be going along pretty good. They were getting settled into the new area. And then bang, dad finds them again. They have to move again. the impact of that on children, you can't even begin to imagine the psychological impact of that on children. And yet nobody was really concerned about this. And rather than stopping the perpetrator from doing this, we were forcing, as a society, these mums and children to move over and over and over again, rather than stopping this perpetrator. And to me, that doesn't make any sense. Because again, it's all about managing the risk. And if you can move the mum and children rather than them being attacked, then that's the option that the society will go for. So move them to avoid them being attacked, but don't lock up the perpetrator for the threat that they pose, which again just doesn't make any sense to me. Some
sobering.
children, their lives were a living hell, really, and yet nobody was even identifying that they were going through this. All the attention was on the adult survivor, and the children were kind of forgotten about, even though it was having just as negative effects on their lives as it was on their mums, even more so in some ways because of their age and their stage of development. Children need quite a high level of safety, security, predictability, routine, and all that was not present. And then some of the children described a different kind of father, but still a very dangerous one. They described how their father would put on a performance of being like a really admirable, really good dad, and he would do this while other people were watching, but then in private, he could be doing what I've just been talking about, be really dangerous. But to the outside world, he was putting on this performance of being a great dad. And sometimes he was also doing that with them as well and making them really confused. So some children described how he would turn up at school and be like, "Oh, darling, it's so great to see you," and make a big fuss of them in front of the other parents and the other teachers. So everyone would be standing there thinking, "Oh, what a great dad." And they would have no idea what he was really like behind closed doors. But by putting on that performance, the children felt like they couldn't explain what was going on because nobody would believe them. Their dad had created a completely false impression of himself. And some dads would also try to convince their children that they were the real victim, and they were very emotionally manipulative with their children. So 2 siblings, little girls, come to mind, Grace and Zoe, not their real names. And they described how they'd been court ordered by the family court to have weekend contact with their dad. And each time they went to see him, he would say things to them like, "Your mum makes me cry, your mum's done all these things to me, it's all your mum's fault, and I'm on antidepressants because I can't see you often enough, and and he would say to them, "You're the only ones who really love me, and I need you," and he made these little girls who were under 10 at the time feel like they were completely responsible for his emotional well-being. So he was giving them the impression that he was refusing to take care of his own well-being, and he was reliant on them, his little daughters, to take care of his well-being by seeing him often and agreeing with him and being his allies. And then when these girls would come back to their mother, they were absolutely distraught. They said they described how they felt like really small and bad, and how it was all their fault, and how one daughter described how her sister would spend every Monday on the sofa just crying and crying into her mother's arms and unable to go to school and just distraught. And yet then he would be calling them up during the week, "You're the only ones who love me, I need to see you more often." So it was just psychological torture for them. And one of the daughters, Grace, when she was about 12, she saw a counsellor who explained to her that this behaviour from her father was very emotionally manipulative. And in her own words, this counsellor had helped me to see what Dad was doing. And over the period of this counselling, she made the decision not to carry on seeing her dad anymore. And then it was like the weight of the world had lifted from her shoulders, and she was able to start recovering. But the ironic thing is that if that dad had insisted on carrying on seeing her, the family court would have probably made her carry on seeing Dad. He could have taken the mum back to the family court. They could have insisted that the contact carry on. They could have not listened to the daughter. That happens so often. And the only reason why he let this daughter go was because by this point he'd found a new partner to abuse, and he'd fathered a new child, and he was busy focused on them. So that's how 12-year-old Grace was able to get away. But if he'd have tried to force her into ongoing contact, that probably would have happened, and she probably would have been forced by the family court.
Yes, it's so difficult with the courts. I know Jesse talks about the case of where there was sexual abuse going on. The court didn't believe that was true, and the child was ordered back into equal care. And I think actually the father got the major care of the child, and the problems are 10 years later still ongoing in the psychological problems. So these are the sorts of things, and just sort of interjecting here quickly, just talking to our therapists who are listening to this, that the idea here is for you to be listening to these stories, this is the sort of feelings, these are the stories that are behind what you're potentially have sitting in front of you. So
that's right.
And so many of these children, they can't articulate what's going on straight away. There's a quote in my paper where one of those little girls was describing how she felt towards her dad, and she was so confused. She said, I just wanted it to stop, and I just wanted him to stop, and I wanted to see him, but I wanted it to stop, and it was just sounding so confused. She was so manipulated that she hardly knew what she was saying. So that's often what presents, is just this jumble of feelings, and I think that's a big clue that something more sinister is going on behind that. I think a really good question with coercive control perpetrators, if you suspect that you've got somebody in front of you who's sort of in their grip, is, are there things that you feel you can't do, or things that you feel you have to do in order to please this person, whether it's your dad, or whether it's like your husband or your boyfriend, or the reverse, if the woman, the mum, is the perpetrator, which is less common but does happen. So are there things that you feel that you can't do, or things that you feel you have to do? Because that starts to tap into these issues around control, And
this is often on a spectrum, isn't it? I mean, I've had plenty of clients who have felt the continual manipulation and control, but they can't point to they say, I can't say there's any one thing that would be bad enough for me to leave, but it's a continual, persistent manipulation and control from a number of different areas.
Exactly. And I think the thing we have to do is help people to realize that is reason enough for them to leave, because it's death by 1,000 cuts.
Yes.
And if you look at each individual cut, it just seems like a little cut, but the result is that you've died. And I guess in these cases, it's your freedom, your autonomy, your very self that dies, because that's what these perpetrators attack. It's an attack on the very selfhood of those around them. I say, to turn them from a free and autonomous person into a slave-like figure, a puppet-like figure. So that is reason enough to leave. Great campaign over here actually in England called Escape the Control, which is about domestic abuse, and how the control is the thing that it's okay to escape from, giving people that permission to escape the control. But at the same time, as I say, as a society, we're really bad at holding perpetrators to account, and you might try to escape, but they carry on controlling. It's so hard to get them to stop unless we crack down on them a lot more than we currently do.
Well, this third one. I'm sorry, just because we're just in there. The third one really is the one that what you call the omnipresent controller, and that's the one. So the dangerous father. I mean, it's when the father is there, it's dangerous. The admiring one, when the father's there. But this omnipresent one is when it seems that all reality has been, is just lost. What's that one like?
So this is where children, they've been through this for a number of years, and they just felt like the threat from their dad was there all the time. And it didn't matter whether it had been months or even years since he last turned up. They were worried about it all the time. It was always either in the back of their minds or the front of their minds. And, one little girl described how I'm until very recently, I didn't feel safe to go out because I was scared that dad might appear again and try and kidnap me again. And, you know, he might have done this 5 years before, but then the next 5 years, she couldn't be free in her own community. She couldn't do ordinary things because she was scared it would happen again. And these kids, you know, they knew that their dads were still out there. They weren't in prison. They knew that there was nothing stopping them from turning up. And it was really scary. So they described how, you know, as young teenagers, they were sleeping in their mum's beds just to try and feel safe enough at night to sleep. They were too scared to be by themselves. They were going around checking all the doors and the windows in the houses, again, because trying to create a feeling of safety for themselves, living under this constant threat. So one thing that we concluded in the article is that for many of these children, it didn't matter that the last incident was months or even years ago. They were still psychologically so scared of what their father might do, and really quite rightly so, because, you know, he could appear at any time, and it was very scary. And so children, again, might present as being highly anxious, perhaps as having OCD, you know, with the door and the window checking. It might seem that their behaviours kind of regress, you know, with the sleeping in their mum's beds. But there's a very real situation behind that, and that's what they need help to talk about and to come you know, to develop strategies to manage in their own heads. And it's just a tragedy that they have to go through this. And of course the mum is also constantly worried and can see the impact it's having on the children, and, you know, they're living their lives in the shadow of this stalking and this ongoing attempt to control them. It's so difficult, and I think there's really quite high numbers of people who are having this experience, and yet it's very hidden. They won't talk about it. They, you know, probably the mums and the children are they're at your schools, you know, they're going into your shops, they're the mums are your colleagues at work. They may not talk about what's going on. They may be pretending that everything's okay, but they're out there, and you probably know them.
Yeah, so there's sorry, I just go quickly, Matt, and then you jump in, because there are a couple of conditions that it's not in the paper there, but sort of long-term bedwetting, some stuttering. Is another thing. Kids go for stuttering, but it's actually a nervous, anxious condition. So there are a number of things as therapists that you need to be looking more deeply at these types of disrupting things. And unfortunately, domestic violence is so prevalent that we need to always make it a possibility, I think, when we're considering. So sorry,
absolutely,
Matt. That was
so which is the value of Emma's research and papers and popular books like Jess's. What I was going to ask Emma is obviously a very big problem socially, probably with the courts. Are you seeing any glimmers of hope for change?
Oh, I wish I could say yes, but not so much at the moment.
No. Okay. Yep.
I think in this country, before the coronavirus, there was a lot of protesting about the family court situation. But I think such a complete culture change is needed in dealing with these situations. It's hard to know how small incremental changes will make much of a difference, because so often the philosophy in the family courts is contact at all costs, you know, right. That contact must happen because it's imagined that somehow not having contact with a parent would be worse than what I just. And I can't agree with that. I think that is a complete failure to listen to the lived experiences of these children. And we know that contact that is forced and contact with, you know, we know from studies has really poor outcomes. I think that the more as societies we understand these issues, and that the politicians deal with them better and make it one of our priorities, the better. The more that the public becomes aware of this, the better. If we think, say, back 50 or 100 years, there were things that were seen as acceptable then, but have changed our way of thinking. So I guess I do have hope that things might be different in the long term, but it's going to take a big culture shift. One thing I would say, though, is that there is some light at the end of the tunnel if survivors are lucky enough that they can get the perpetrator out of their lives, which does sometimes happen, after a period of some time, they absolutely thrive, and they can go on to have really, really wonderful lives. Children described, like some of the children I'd interviewed, they were safe now. It had taken a long time, but they were feeling eventually, quite safe, and they were recovering. And they said, like, that before life had been all dull and that they didn't really like life very much, and now they felt free, they felt happy, they felt like they could do what they wanted to do. They were looking forward to things, they were learning new skills, they were feeling more confident. So it was like their life had begun, and the same with some others as well. So if we can help these people to be safe, and if they can get free, then there really is amazing things at the end of the tunnel for them. I don't think we hear about that often enough.
No.
Yeah.
So
that's a beautiful thing. And I wonder if in that feeling of being safe and that there is recovery when the work is done, even though perhaps broadly it's going to require us to be even more brave with our social change and adjustment, that's a sort of a pretty nice note to sort of find ourselves winding up. We're around that time. But is there anything that you'd like to add as a final sort of comment or parting thought as we just sort of wind ourselves up?
I think just to say that domestic abuse, if we just think of it as physical violence, we miss so much. It's a liberty crime. It's a crime about taking away somebody's liberty, their freedom, their autonomy. It's a human rights violation, and that's what Evan Stark says, and I really agree with that. So people, are living their lives in these conditions where it's like they are in prison in their own lives. There's a really good book for survivors called Invisible Chains, which is about how to escape from coercive control, and it really is invisible chains. So I think that we need to stop thinking about it as physical violence and really see what is going on there. The physical violence obviously is really awful and harrowing and dangerous, but some perpetrators don't use it at all, and they're no less dangerous for that. And indeed, some of the perpetrators that go on to kill their partners were never violent before that moment, and then boom, they kill. And they don't kill because they were provoked or they were pushed to it or anything like that. They kill because it's the ultimate act of control. I control you so much that I will now choose to take your life away from you, or I will choose to take the children's lives away from them. And that's really awful. And very often our media doesn't get that when there's been one of these killings. So I think that we need to see it as a liberty crime, as a human rights violation, and we really, really need to crack down on perpetrators who are mostly males, but sometimes females as well, and see I think they're some of the most dangerous individuals in our society, and some of the most harmful and some of the most destructive individuals in our society. And I don't think we're anywhere near close to recognizing that yet, and it's got to be recognized more.
Yes,
well, we really appreciate.
Yeah.
Sorry, we really.
No, I was just going to say, Matt, that we need to think about it not just as violence. We need to think about it.
Yeah.
And therapists are in a great position to think about it and become aware. Yeah, that was all, Matt. Yeah.
Well, we just really appreciate you putting the spotlight on these issues, and yourself, researchers like yourself, and writers, like Jess. You're the people that are going to cause this cultural shift, which then will filter through to the court system, and we will get to the end of the tunnel. So
it's part of it, but it's also people like yourselves, transmitting the research findings out to the people who are really on the ground. I think for therapists as well, I think one more thing is that perpetrators don't do very well in therapy. What they need is perpetrator programs that hold them to account and that are focused on changing their attitudes, values, and beliefs about what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. And that's not really the role of therapy at all. So I'm always extremely concerned about perpetrators in therapy, because it's not what they actually need. And I'm sure you also know that doing therapy for couples in this situation is incredibly dangerous and should always be avoided, because the power imbalance is such that anything that the survivor might say to the perpetrator in that session, the perpetrator's going to hold it against them later. Is incredibly dangerous, so that really must be avoided at all costs.
Yes, Matt and I are great advocates. This therapy is under we practice it within limited frameworks, and we shouldn't. So therapy, as you say, a lot of therapies, but what we're trying to do is get therapists to realize they need to act more boldly, and perhaps they're not just going to have talk or whatever it is, but to engage in programs and to engage in things. And we hope to, those are things to bring to connect. So that's really great. When you're a therapist and you see this stuff, you need to do more. You need to do exactly what you said. Find programs that change the culture. That's beautiful. Yeah.
Okay.
Very,
wonderful.
very, very encouraging.
Okay. Dr. Emma Katz, it's been wonderful having you on the show. Thank you so much for the work that you do and for talking to us about it all.
Thanks so much. It's been great.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye then.